welcome to Oakville Matters. One of the things that matters most to Oakville is having good snow service during the winter. And with me today is the man who's in charge of delivering the high quality of service that we're used to, Martin Maguire. Martin, thank you for being with us today. I want you to tell me a story, and to protect the innocent, don't say where the people are from, but what happened to your brother?
Well, my brother was hosting a social event this past weekend. He lives in the Falgarwood area of town, and a number of his guests were coming from the west, from Burlington and Hamilton, and a lot of them arrived, during the snowstorm to say how difficult the travel was in Hamilton and Burlington, but once they got to Oakville, things were nice and clear, so it's nice to hear those compliments.
So, well, thank you for the forthright telling of the story. You didn't clean it up to protect the innocent or anything. You must be an engineer.
Yeah, I am.
Engineers are known for a fairly direct and blunt style, in my experience. So, let's start off about snow clearing. I mean, it's obvious that we do it for safety, although I have lived places where not so much. I lived in Northern Ontario when I was young and strong, and the attitude there was, we're probably not going to clear your street. You're probably going to drive on snowpack. And if you don't like it, get some chains. And if you don't like that, you may not make it here. But here in the South, we have a different attitude.
Yes, we do. And in fact, we're governed by certain provincial standards, minimum maintenance standards, to keep our roads in a state of good repair. And that includes, there's the general traveling public, motorists, pedestrians, cyclists, but we also have to make sure that other town services like emergency services, transit services can operate the way they're intended.
Right, so sort of one rule for the entire province, I imagine, and yet each city winds up delivering a different level of service. I know that a few years ago, our council decided that they wanted to plow as soon as there was a smaller minimum amount of snow. Can you explain that?
You're right that the provincial standards are a minimum set of standards. So it's fair to say in Oakville that when it comes to winter maintenance, we exceed a number of the standards. And those standards have evolved over time. So for example, I think what you're referring to is in 2018, our threshold for plowing sidewalks went from 5 centimeters to 8 centimeters, which means there's more of an onus on being proactive before snow and ice begins to fall or ice begins to form to treat our sidewalks, but the threshold has changed.
Well, but on the streets, we went the other direction. There was a provincial standard. I don't remember what the number is actually, and we lowered it so that we plowed sooner or more often.
That's correct. That's correct.
And council didn't do that all on its own. It was, I think, the pressure of the residents wanting a higher level of service. Right. Speaking of sidewalks, I lived in Toronto for a time, and I remember being shocked to discover when I moved there that there was a $150 fine waiting for me if I didn't shovel my own sidewalk, and there was a time limit.
Right.
And there was a widow lady, an older lady next door to me who really couldn't be expected to do that, and I quickly discovered that the city's attitude was, well, you do it.
Right, which is different, of course, in Oakville, where there is no such bylaw. In fact, we'll get residents calling in saying, I'm going away for my winter vacation. What happens if it snows? And I have to reassure them that it's not the homeowner's responsibility. It is the town's responsibility to maintain the sidewalks during the winter.
I imagine some would worry about having their driveway unshoveled being a signal to people that they weren't home. And perhaps they make an arrangement with a neighborhood kid or kids,
right,
to come around and hack
or a
at
contractor,
yeah. So how do we decide? I mean, I'm sure we would plow every street simultaneously if we could, although I suspect that's a mathematical impossibility. How do we decide who to do first?
So there is a road classification system. So every street is either classified as primary, secondary, or residential. So the primaries, for example, would be things like Dundas and Trafalgar, mainly our regional road system, where it's the highest traffic volume. Those are the routes that carry transit. It's what our emergency vehicles use to get from A to B. Secondary roads are done after the primary roads, so the primary roads are treated first. Secondary roads are those types of roads that would connect the primaries to residentials. And the residentials are your typical local road. The way we tried to develop the secondary road network, which receives a higher level of service. So we start with the primaries, we then move on to the secondary roads before we treat residentials. But the way we've set up the network, if you happen to live on a residential road that gets, relatively speaking, the lower level of service, usually you only have to travel about 250, 300 meters before you reach a secondary, which has a bare pavement policy. So even if you're on one of the residential streets, you don't have very far to go before you're on a street that has bare pavement.
And I imagine that the further into the residential network you are, the further, like if you're in a remote court, you're bound to have to be not first.
Correct.
Because, just to get to you is going to be a go.
Correct. But even
and
when
doing you first would be like the opposite of efficient.
Exactly. And even when we're in a full plowing event, the town is broken up into a number of zones. So we break it into about 33 different zones. So we're in each zone simultaneously. It's not like we start at one end of town and work to the other. We're working in a number of locations simultaneously.
Oh yeah, there's two things. This is Oakville. We expect and we get a high level of service. And we have engineers design this, which means it's mathematical and fairly logical. I have seen events, though, where the snow is falling so much that it seems like we have to put every truck on the major arterials and just go up and down to keep them clear.
That's right. It's a continuous operation to achieve that bare pavement policy.
Yeah, so far we've had, I think I can call it a light winter.
Yeah, although we had an early start. Our first snow event was November the 11th, which is actually a bit before even our contractors are scheduled to be on board, although they're available and they helped us out without any issue.
Yeah, I didn't get overwhelmed with complaints on November 11th. In fact, all to the contrary, I got compliments about how well that we did. But it was a non-event in so many ways. It was a freak. You're supposed to just ignore those exceptions to the rule.
And like I said, our contractors were able to provide almost 100% of the equipment that they would normally provide within the limits of the contract.
So now, I also get, I don't get a lot of this anymore. The environmental consciousness has gotten much better, but I still do get people demanding more salt because they think it'll melt. And quite apart from the effort we make to be economical in our use of salt and the fact that we mix it with other things, there's the issue of it's not that effective outside of a narrow little band, as I understand it. Can you speak to that?
You're right, that below about -8 degrees, we're not applying brine, and salt becomes less effective. So we do have to consider the temperature and what types of precipitation we're receiving. That'll dictate what our response is.
And we have sand as a backup.
We do use sand, particularly on residential streets. So as part of the council-adopted salt management plan, we don't use salt on residential roads. We will plow them. It's okay that they're in snowpack condition, but after maybe some back-to-back events, we will frequently sand residentials just to ensure that there is proper traction.
And it's not, it's happened on my street. It's a little bit rough going if the conditions are bad enough, but it's not the end of the world. It's certainly not Northern Ontario.
Right. And we do get that feedback from residents who live on residentials. Like I said, after we've had, maybe back-to-back events, the residentials can get a bit bumpy. But like I said earlier,
that's nature's way of telling you to slow down.
So, well, built-in traffic calming, yes.
Well, when the roads are clear, all I hear about is how everybody's going too fast.
Too fast.
And they want me to stop them.
And like I said, those types of conditions you'll only see on residential streets. And as I said earlier, typically you only have to travel about 250, 300 meters before you reach a secondary.
But your brother's on a residential street.
He is.
And he still looked good. Now, did he get special treatment?
No
Okay.
Special treatment for relatives.
Like the family gets worse treatment. So now, we've got quite a route map. And do you want to talk about how we've developed it? I mean, it's an astonishing number of kilometers just to start with.
Yeah, so we have almost 2,000 lane kilometers of roadway that we're responsible for. And I should mention that although Halton Region has jurisdiction over the major arterials like Dundas, Trafalgar, and Neagawa, we provide the winter maintenance service on a cost recovery basis. Yeah. But that map, that classification of primary, secondary, residential has been developed over the past number of decades, really, as the town grows. North of Dundas, we start to inherit roads from the developers who start off maintaining those brand new roads, and that at a certain point hand them off to us, and we have to decide whether they're primary, secondary, residential.
Yeah, I haven't heard from anybody in those circumstances any complaints that service went down after the handover, which is possibly a good sign, good for us. What about sidewalks? If we have 2,000 lane kilometers of road, have we got a couple of kilometers of sidewalks?
Almost a kilometer worth of sidewalks, which
almost 1,000 or 1 kilometer.
Almost 1,000 kilometers of sidewalk.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which has its own level of service and thresholds versus roadways. So in some cases, there may be, we're out plowing and salting the primaries and secondaries, but if there's only 3 or 4 centimeters, we're probably not going to be plowing sidewalks.
Yeah. So how do we decide, is there a hierarchy for sidewalks?
There is. So the primaries and secondaries, our threshold for plowing is 5 centimeters. Once we reach that threshold, we'll be out treating the primaries and secondaries. The threshold for residential sidewalks is a little higher. So residents might see a sidewalk machine on something like Trafalgar and say, well, why aren't you doing sidewalks on my street? And the reason is that there is that higher threshold for residentials. And
that's, I hope it's obvious there's more pedestrians on Trafalgar than there are on your street.
Correct.
But, I stand to be corrected on that. So, so just to clear it up, what is the minimum amount, or I guess that's the right word, how much does it have to accumulate before we start rolling stuff on sidewalks and on streets?
Let me start with roadways. Like I said, for the primaries and secondaries, we always want bare pavement. So as soon as the snow is starting to accumulate and stick, we will be salting. In fact, in advance of some snowfall, we'll be out putting down, doing what we call anti-icing, putting down brine, which basically prevents the snow from bonding to the pavement and reduces the amount of salt we have to put down.
That's probably counterintuitive for some people.
Right. But it is that bonding. Once it's stuck, to use the non-technical term, then you're having to use a lot more salt to get it off the roadway.
So, what about residential streets?
So residential streets, the threshold for the street itself is about 7.5 centimeters, which sounds very exact, but it's really a holdover from the imperial 3 inches, which
It sounds like 3
yes,
inches, yeah.
equates to 7.5 centimeters. So that's the threshold for plowing of residentials, and the plowing of residential sidewalks is 8 centimeters.
Yeah, now, I think I could live with, I don't want to cause a storm of protest, but I could live with 3 inches of snow on my residential street. But, and I'm pretty sure that it used to be 4 inches or so before we rolled, and then we decided, no, we were going to start at 3. Do you have a professional opinion on this?
Well, again, a lot of it is connected to our salt management plan. You know, we want to minimize the amount of salt we're using, and just overall, you know, every time we roll a truck with an operator in it, that's just more cost. So we're trying to minimize.
Plowing reduces salting. Am I hearing that?
Well, on the residentials,
In the residential context?
yeah, on the residentials, we try not to use salt at all. So it's really just the plowing operation.
So when you plow wouldn't affect the salt.
Correct.
Yes. So how do you know how well you're doing during a winter event? Do you have to drive around constantly during the storm? Are you out there in a parka with a walkie-talkie? What's going on?
I'm not personally. I show up at the depot and bring the guys coffee. That's my job. We do have staff. We do have inspection staff who are out confirming, particularly with our contractors, that areas that they say they've completed have been completed. We also do have electronic tracking on all of our equipment, both town equipment and contracted equipment, that will show when a zone has been completed. And residents might be familiar with the Plow Oakville tracker, which they can use to see sort of the progress of our plowing operation. Sometimes we do have equipment failures. It's electronics. It's not perfect. So we do make sure that our inspection staff are out there confirming that what the contractor says is done is in fact done.
Yeah, so the GPS tracking of the plow isn't exactly Uber coming to your house.
No.
It's more like, I would call it chunky. You know, your street goes from not plowed color to plowed color, meaning it's done now.
Correct, and admittedly, it's not real time. There is a bit of a delay, but really, we see the value as if somebody's wondering, well, geez, are they coming to my street? They can look at the Plow Oakville app, and if you see streets in your neighborhood are done, you can be rest assured that they're coming.
Or you can be alarmed that you got forgotten and start calling us.
Well, there always is that option.
And we have Service Oakville for that purpose.
Correct.
And now you should reassure people, you take the work orders from Service Oakville and you pay attention to them.
Oh, absolutely. We work very closely with Service Oakville and communication staff, giving them updates on the status of our operations, you know, when we're moving from primaries and secondaries into residential plowing, you know, when we're starting sidewalk plowing, when those operations are complete. Things like our seniors windrow program, letting them know when that has been initiated, so that when they receive the calls, they are well armed with accurate, timely information.
And I track that. I think do we have 400 signed up for that?
Just over 400 this year.
And so we've got 80,000 household units in Oakville, so it gives you an idea of the level of service that's required to look after that part of the population that needs it, and we're happy to provide it. One of the things I've always been fascinated by is that, you know, our service, our promise of service is that, you know, 24 hours after the end of the event, we'll have you relatively clear, and if you need sooner, you're going to have to sort of think frontier spirit.
Yes, the seniors windrow program, it does take as about 12 hours after we're done residential plowing, we should be complete with the windrow program, but that's a total of about 36 hours.
Yeah, so
people
for the
need to be
windrow, you
patient.
really, when you know the storm is coming, you're going to have to either plan ahead or get people to help you plan ahead.
Correct.
I don't know what else we could do. Now we deploy 80 to 100 pieces of equipment.
During a full-blown event, when we're out dealing with primaries, secondaries, and residentials, when all of our thresholds have been met, that's correct. Combination of town staff and equipment and contractors.
So is it hard to find, I mean, what are the economics of this? Like, there can't be an endless supply of equipment for hire out there, and there's only so many that, I mean, we have to figure out what's the sweet spot of how many to have ourselves and how many to contract. How do you do that?
Well, our contracts dictate, the number of pieces of equipment that the contractor must provide. Our contracts are typically multi-year because we realize that the contractor has to invest, make the capital investment in the equipment.
Well, we don't want other cities stealing our folks either.
Exactly. So, typical contracts would run, 4 to 5 years. I think generally the contractors enjoy working with the town and they're eager to renew, keep their prices competitive.
Yeah. So I do worry about poaching. The pressure from disappointed residents of other cities presumably at some point is going to have people trying to get some of what we've locked up.
Right. And I think some of the credit goes to our staff who manage the contractors. We don't just let them out there. We're meeting with them regularly during the winter to review performance concerns. The reality is that although it might be the same contractor, it's not necessarily the same operators every year. So we have new operators coming in. We run a training program with them so that they know what our expectations are.
Oh, speaking of that, every year there'll be a sidewalk with a curve and some turf torn during an event, often in the dark. And if the snow's deep enough, and you have to understand the conditions that the person's working in. It's not necessarily that they're new and experienced or whatever. It could be just that it's really hard working conditions. We fix that. You want to talk about that?
That's correct. So the sidewalk operation is a combination of town staff and contractors, so it may be one or the other. But in either case, if you have some sod damage, we log those locations and we will be back in the spring to do a repair.
That's right. So just phone your service Oakville and log the damage, and the town makes it good. And we do that every year.
That's correct.
And once you know that, your anxiety about it subsides. But if I do get calls from new residents who are not aware of this, and they're very keyed up.
Yes.
Don't worry, relax, we'll look after it. So now we've got the Plow Oakville map we talked about. Is social media starting to play a role in this, or are we still not? I mean, how do people work out their anxiety about snow clearing?
Well, absolutely, we use social media channels. Like I said earlier, we work very closely with our communications staff. We provide them with the basic information and then leave it up to them to convey that message. So there's the town website, oakville.ca. There are the electronic message boards at town facilities like community centers that would provide updates or maybe some basic information about, say, for example, the Seniors Windrow program. And then Twitter is used to provide more of the real-time updates during an event.
And if you have information for the town during a snow event, you can phone 905-815-5999 and tell Service Oakville, and they'll make sure the right people get the news. Now, Martin, you mentioned that the season started ahead of schedule this season. How late does it go when it obeys our plan?
Yeah. So for our staff that are on winter shift and our winter contracts, they both are scheduled to end on April the 15th.
And we normally expect snow not to have... December 1st is when we expect things to start being possible, right?
Yes.
So yeah, November 11th was a little bit of an early call.
A little early, but we were ready.
And just to give you a flavor of how early, our contractors are on standby starting like the middle of the month.
Yes, November 15th.
But to be on standby on the 15th, you pretty much already knew that might happen on the 11th, and thus the good result.
That's right, and the equipment was already in our yard and they had their staff ready, so we were prepared.
Now, one of the things that concerns me as I see more and more people putting too many cars in their driveway, like, I don't know, the kids grow up and they've got, anyway, on my street, there's 2 cars in the driveway, and somebody's got a car on the apron, as I call it. And during a snow event, I wonder if that prevents a windrow. But we are pretty good about wanting you to get your car off the street for obvious reasons. What kind of cooperation do you see getting?
It's not 100% perfect like a lot of things, but there is in fact a bylaw that prohibits parking on town streets 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. during that November 15th to April 15th period. And the logic is quite simple, that the first time the plow might go by, there may be parked vehicles, but then there's that snow underneath the vehicle that we can't get at. So we use those overnight periods to do snow removal where there is on-street parking.
So there's follow-up where we have to deal with residents who didn't get the bulletin.
Well, yes, like I said, it's not perfect. Sometimes it requires multiple visits for us in the middle of the night until we get a period where there is no parked car.
Yes, and meanwhile, most residents, if you just ask them without any context or background info, would go, "We want things to be efficient." Well, efficiency has a lot of roots,
Yes.
and that might be one of them. Now, we give special service to our business improvement areas.
Correct.
How special is that?
So when we start salting on our primary, secondary roads and we know an event is coming, the sidewalks and the BIAs are the first sidewalks that we treat. And they're the only sidewalks where we will use salt. And that's really just in recognition that those are areas of town with the highest pedestrian volumes, obviously a concentration of businesses. So we want to absolutely ensure, ease of mobility for pedestrians and safety, of course.
So when we add it all up, we're spending a lot of money on winter control. I love the expression winter control, as if we're controlling winter. So like $6 million.
Correct.
How much of that is salt and brine and all that stuff?
Salt material is about $1.3 million of that $6 million just for the material alone.
Well, I think this has been a master's degree in winter control or snow clearing. Martin, thank you very much for joining me today to explain it so well. As always, if you have questions or concerns, I'm reachable very easily by email, mayor@oakville.ca. I look forward to hearing from you about anything, and I look forward to seeing you here again on Oakville Matters.